Before anything on Petrichor 5, there were two brothers, Providence and Mithrix. Providence could create soul, life, fill constructs with life force. Mithrix could make said constructs. Mithrix lived to explore, conquer, his unending curiosity of the universe he was spawned in. He knew his power above others, and had no intention of bending the knee to any. Providence took interest in the lower life forms, granting them refuge and hope in his home, though he was more of a commanding, less benevolent god to them. This video is not intended to be a lore analysis of Risk of Rain 1 and 2. Plenty of those exist, and I don't have to bleed into that. I just do have to explain some of the lore, because the background can be important for what I'm focusing on. This video is more focused on the feelings from Risk of Rain. Feelings that I can't necessarily say come from the words of the game or even the gameplay. It comes from the soul of the series. Knowing the importance, though, of Mithrix and Providence will help take us to what I consider to be the core feeling from Risk of Rain, that being remorse. So let's dive in and start with the first game. Risk of Rain, the first one, released in 2013, developed by Hapu Games. It received pretty notable acclaim, especially for being released in an era before indie games were quite as huge as they are now. It's a side-scrolling shooter with roguelite elements, and it features an aesthetic that I love. It's easy to brush it off as basic pixel art, but there's something so excellent to me about the way Risk of Rain looks. The palette does a large amount, I think, to convey the feelings that I love most from the game. It's dark. Not dull, but dark. The colors are vivid, and nothing is flat necessarily, but it feels correctly alien and enchanting. The detailed art that shows in the logbooks showcases the artist's real talent, with excellent creature design and just beautiful pixel art. The world of Risk of Rain feels perfectly alien, which it is. You're both not on a planet of your own, but it's a planet that most of the fauna is not native to. Providence has throughout the passage of time snatched up various species from doomed planets. Whatever reason they are facing extinction or some other form of ruin, Providence helped provide them shelter. Let's talk a bit about the gameplay now. The gameplay of Risk of Rain, as mentioned earlier, it's a side-scrolling action roguelite. However, I think where Risk of Rain shines is its take on the roguelite formula. Many of the popular roguelites, especially at the time, The Binding of Isaac, Nuclear Throne, they didn't really bombard you with too many upgrades. Isaac, you'd get a few items per floor, and Nuclear Throne you'd end up with a mutation every couple stages, which are both perfectly fine formulas. However, I think Risk of Rain shines above them for its emphasis on quantity. While the common items in the first game aren't the most inspired, they all shine in the raw amount you get. Each stage and chests alone, you gain, say, around a dozen plus items. Allow me to mention, if it wasn't obvious, that items in Risk of Rain stack pretty much infinitely, so duplicates aren't something to fear, but something to embrace. To combat the amount of items that you get, Risk of Rain features a unique difficulty scaling mechanic that works off of raw time. The longer you spend in a run, the harder it becomes. Enemies become stronger, more elite types start spawning. Before long, bosses will spawn and fill your screen naturally. The trade-off in the player's favor here is those bosses that naturally spawn also drop items. So once you get a run going, make it past the first few stages, live, say, 20 minutes-ish, the brakes come off in Risk of Rain, and fast. You'll soon be gaining a lot of items per stage, while mowing down exceedingly larger and larger waves of enemies. Bosses that took all of your effort at the start are sprinkled into the mix alongside the Lemurians, and you better hope you've been keeping up your pace to outscale them. It's such a fun gameplay loop of balancing unlimited power on your end with pretty much infinitely scaling enemies. Sort of an unstoppable force meets immovable object kind of vibe. Now, you'd think this game would feel like a power fantasy. I mean, by endgame you're likely covering the screen in explosions, bodies, and particles. However, not really. In regards to the gameplay, you're always on the brink of death. No matter how strong you think you are, if you lapse your attention long enough, you will die. It always feels like a fight for survival, which makes sense. I haven't mentioned yet that you're a stranded survivor from a shipwreck over Petrichor 5, the planet Risk of Rain takes place on. And as mentioned in the logbooks, every single lifeform on this planet seems to want you dead. They claim there's no explanation for it, Even the most peaceful of species go berserk at the sight of a human, and they want nothing more than for you to stop what you're doing. Except actually, there is an explanation. These are orders from Providence, who has a pretty tight grip on the planet. In fact, he's why your ship crashed. He is why you're stuck in this fight for survival. You're on someone else's turf, and he wants you gone. Now is about the time I start talking about my absolute favorite part of Risk of Rain. And it's the part where the title of the video really starts to come into play. The music of Risk of Rain, composed by Christodoulou, is unfucking believable. You've been hearing it underneath the audio here a bit throughout the video, but I'm gonna let it breathe a little. It's so perfect for the setting of Risk of Rain. Alien, daunting, almost calming. It's also foreboding in a lot of places. Reminders that you aren't where you should be. You're an invader on this planet. The fauna here, while not natural, it's their home, not yours. And you're going on a rampage through their home. You're not a monster in Risk of Rain, but your actions are not those of triumph or righteousness. And the music reminds you of this constantly. The intense tracks aren't framed in a way to pump you up, make you feel like some sort of god. They're almost more cries of pain. That's at least the way I interpret them. The synth that hangs over many of the tracks is wailing, and that term is useful in both describing the way it sounds and the meaning it holds. It's not happy music. A lot of it comes out at you feeling sad more than anything. It's beautiful though. No track in the entire OST embodies this more than Coalescence. Coalescence plays on the final stage of Risk of Rain, aptly titled Risk of Rain. On this stage, you're back on the UES Contact Light, which was the ship you were a passenger of that crash-landed on Petrichor 5. Coalescence is unbelievable. For a final stage in a game like Risk of Rain, you'd expect fast, intense music that is built to do nothing but fill you with adrenaline. But you're greeted with this calm, restrained synth. Just listen to it. It's soul-piercing. You can just feel the emotion of the notes vibrate within you. It's nothing short of beautiful, and the music serves as an unforgettable foil to the gameplay. While you have this calm, yet daunting melody playing over you, absolute chaos and destruction is occurring. This is when Risk of Rain hits peak levels of do or die, and you are swimming in new items constantly dropping from the endless bosses and scavengers spawning that are all trying their hardest to kill you. It's absolute carnage, but with this synth over it all, this orderly music, you start to feel remorse. The music reminds you of what you're doing. It takes you out of the adrenaline. It confronts you with the reality that you are slaughtering countless others who are also only trying to survive. You're not the villain here. The events of Risk of Rain are too murky to call anyone a villain, but you aren't a hero either. The wailing as Coalescence picks up is the best proof you need to know you're no hero. You're just a survivor. Coalescence on its own is still, I consider, one of the most evocative and beautiful tracks I've ever heard. There's no surprise it is one that many hold dearly from the first Risk of Rain, and I am not alone in having it as my favorite track, though Arctic Oscillation is definitely a close second. However, in combination with the gameplay, Coalescence is the rawest form of the themes and feelings of Risk of Rain confronting you. Any player who wants to gain something deeper from the game will be barraged with raw emotion that the two elements overlapping presents. It's nothing short of genius design on both the game developer's part and the composer. You're confronted with raw remorse for all those who have died, wondering if there was any other way. Once you reach the bridge of the UES Light, you're confronted by Providence, Bulwark of the Weak. I don't think I need to say that doesn't feel like the name of someone who's a villain. Providence may be a harsh god, but he does have intentions of protection. Too controlling, but it's not done out of malice, more of fear. However, Providence is now the only thing standing between you and safety, and what's one more body laid to rest? The grief you feel for all that have died before already hangs over you like tens of tons. What's one more? Providence's theme when fighting him is aptly foreboding for who he is. While to you, another obstacle, he's Petrichor 5's last line of defense from invaders. If all else fails, he will have to kill you personally, something he's very good at. Though again, his music doesn't necessarily hype the player up in the same way many other final boss tracks do. It's foreboding and threatening. as you're facing someone who is far beyond anything you've ever faced. As the song progresses, you're confronted again with the wailing cries of Petrichor 5. This isn't your triumphant stand, it's Providence's. As I've said many times before, you're not the hero in Risk of Rain, and neither is Providence. He's doing what he does to protect the weak, or at least that's how he views it. After slaying Providence, you take your leave of Petrichor 5, hoping to never come back. However, you're greeted with a special ending quote for each character, and these ending quotes, while short, are very, very important. They're important enough that I'll read off each one here, so get ready. Commando, and so he left, with everything but his humanity. Enforcer, and so he left, mutated beyond recognition. Bandit, and so he left, with his Pyrrhic plunder. Huntress, and so she left, her soul still remaining on the planet. Handy, and so it left, servos pulsing with new life. Engineer, and so he left, more steel in circuit than man. Miner, and so he left, adrenaline still rushing through his veins. Sniper, and so they left, the sound still ringing in deaf ears. Acrid, and so it left, with a new hunger, to be left alone. Mercenary, and so he left, never to become human again. Loader, and so he left, ready to rebuild his life, brick by brick. Chef, and so it left, entirely forgetting its original purpose. So these quotes, while not all of them follow the formula, are pretty important to the feelings I've discussed. Almost all of them involve the characters losing a part of themselves due to the senseless slaughter they've committed. Our player characters are all filled with almost nothing but remorse. With the exception of just Miner, they're all at best indifferent towards their actions, and for the most part, horrified. Horrified they'll never be the same. They gave up their humanity, their morals, just to survive, and they feel horrible about it. This carries over a bit more, as Providence's monster log states. I recognized him from the security footage. He was the one who blew the cargo hatches open. He was the one who killed everyone. Providence, as I came to call him, moved faster and with more purpose than anything else I've seen on this planet. He must command great power, for he seemed to easily control 2 great gilded worms of a species similar to the magma worm. Is he able to command everyone on this planet? I don't know his purpose or his reasoning, but he did not give me a choice. I had to kill him. So why do I feel like I've made a terrible mistake? Risk of Rain 2, entering early access in 2019 and exiting in 2020, is, as the name implies, the sequel to Risk of Rain. Risk of Rain 2 brought a lot of change, jumping into the third dimension after the first game's 2D plane, with a better focus on multiplayer as well. Risk of Rain 2 was a smash success. The gameplay of Risk of Rain 2 is pretty much the gold standard for games of its ilk. There's pretty much no third-person shooter roguelite on the market that stands up to it, and I applaud Hoppo Games thoroughly for their ambitious efforts in making it. Risk of Rain 2 shares a lot of design elements with the first. Loot is handled the same way, with many chests scattered around the map, and the same idea of infinitely stacking it up still exists. Though a notable change is that while difficulty scales in the same way as the first game, naturally spawning bosses don't drop items. And furthermore, there's no item like the 56-leaf clover to have elites drop items as well. So your scaling, outside of artifacts, is going to be tied to chest spawns. This isn't a problem by any means. I would say the average item in Risk of Rain 2 is much more useful than the average item in the first, which makes sense because you definitely get much less of them in raw quantity. And don't get me wrong, you're still showered in loot. Furthermore, you're able to have more agency than ever over what you get. With the advent of scrappers and 3D printers, items in Risk of Rain 2 allow for more of an actual build than the first game. With the third dimension being added, many of the survivors that returned had their kits shaped up a bit to match it, and they were translated so amazingly, it's impressive as hell. Loader grappling around the map at blinding speeds, Bandit weaving around resetting cooldowns with swift backstab headshots. The new survivors are also very impressively designed. Rex's gameplay loop of sacrificing HP to regain it with other abilities, the Void Fiend and its corruption meter, It's all very eloquently designed. Risk of Rain 2 has a lot more flow than the first game in the gameplay. However, this video isn't really about the gameplay of these two games. I just had to talk about some of the changes here because they translate to the change in tone as well. While Risk of Rain 1 is a game about survival, you crash land on Petrichor 5 and are fighting your way through the planet to save your own skin, Risk of Rain 2 is a rescue mission. On the UES Safe Travels, you and the many other crewmates are coming to Petrichor 5 to save anyone left from the UES contact light, recover any cargo, and figure out what happened to the ship. It's important to note that by the time Risk of Rain 2 takes place, the events of the first game have already transpired, which is obvious, but it's very relevant. You see, after Providence is killed, the planet of Petrichor 5 begins to change. It's easy to assume the inhabitants of it, and those who may wish to inhabit it, became more savage, less controlled. I like to think this is represented in the gameplay of Risk of Rain 2, and is why many of the enemies appear more advanced in combat than they used to be. Obviously, on a game design level, the shift to 3D allows for just more variety in enemy attack, but this explanation works so well with me, I'm gonna roll with it. Alongside the enemies growing more advanced, the presence of the other brother I've mentioned is growing more and more. See, I talked a lot about Providence recently, so you may have forgotten about his brother Mithrix. Mithrix did not have the same noble ambitions of Providence, more interested in the function of things, and more importantly their combat capabilities. His increased command over Petrichor 5 could be considered another thematic reason for the enemies growing in capability. Mithrix's presence is also represented in the gameplay as well, this showing in the lunar items, which are designed by Mithrix himself. And since I've skipped over an important piece of lore, I have to circle back to it here. Before the events of both games, Providence and Mithrix spent some time designing the teleporters you see in-game, and their test run of these teleporters was one going to the moon. And in the test run, Mithrix went up to the moon, while Providence stayed back. Providence ended up destroying the teleporter that took Mithrix there. This left Mithrix stranded on the moon for an extremely long time, and Mithrix grew very unhappy about it over this time. For while Mithrix cared mostly about power and such, he did care a lot about his brother, so the betrayal stung, though after millennia, there's no discounting that his care turned to resentment. Anyway, back to the present. So Risk of Rain 2 is in a more Mithrix-influenced Petrichor 5. This does change the tone of the game. It's still Remorse, but it's more active and pounding. If the first game's feelings of remorse were somber, the second's are oppressive, which matches the feel of Mithrix compared to Providence. The world of Risk of Rain 2 is also filled with more influences of us invaders. A lot more of the stages hold structures built by humans, attempted outposts and camps. And of course, I have to talk about the music. I spent a lot of time thinking and comparing the soundtracks of Risk of Rain 1 and 2, because they're both incredible. Risk of Rain 2 features so many songs that are absolutely rich with emotion. I mean, listen to that. If that doesn't make you feel, I don't know what would. And this quality is kept all throughout the soundtrack, with that piercing synth from the first game remaining. Something else important about the gap between Risk of Rain 1 and 2 is that the killing of Providence allowed something new to creep in, the Void. Risk of Rain 2 baseline had a few Void enemies, furthermore it had some Void-centric areas, and it was definitely shown as a theme of importance. However, this really carries over within the first DLC for Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain 2, Survivors of the Void. This lets us see what allowing the Void in really did to the planet of Petrichor 5, with hotspots of corruption and infection flowing through the planet, and new otherworldly creatures that don't feel alien, they feel interdimensional. The Void coming in to overtake Petrichor 5 is one of the many lasting mistakes that the Survivor from Risk of Rain 1 caused. And this is a part where Remorse really shines. We are now seeing the aftermath in real time of what the killing of Providence did. And while it isn't our player character's fault, we have to accept the repercussions. It's why I think this track titled Once in a Lullaby, releasing with the Survivors of the Void DLC, feels so extra powerful. It's one of the most beautiful songs I've heard, even by Risk of Rain standards. The repeating melody, the woodwind at the start, and that standard Risk of Rain style synth cutting in. There's no words to describe this track. It's so overbearing, so powerful, more distinctly sad than anything else, which is why I think Risk of Rain 2 is not remorse for what you are doing, it's remorse for what has been done. There is no undoing the past events of the first game, but you can feel the emotions caused by them. Petrichor 5 is lashing out, wailing back at you like those synths I've described before. The planet is in a state of disrepair, and things are only getting worse. This is why I believe Risk of Rain 2 ramps up in chaos more than the first. While you aren't scaling as exponentially as you do in the first game, Risk of Rain 2 feels more chaotic with the added dimension. Petrichor 5 and its ecosystem are coming apart at the seams, and you're not helping with your rescue attempts. An already broken planet is growing more and more disheveled by the actions of the player in Risk of Rain 2. Eventually, through our carnage on the planet, we find ourselves on the moon, our final stage, and wouldn't you know it, those same notes return. Con lentitud poderosa is a track that is obviously meant to evoke Coalescence, but it does so in a transformative way, not necessarily providing the same emotions as the first, but its own uniquely powerful ones. The initial design of the final stage in Risk of Rain 2 is uniquely powerful to me. It was pretty much just a straight line with a few enemies, and then the music. And boy, does the music go wild during it. Take a listen to this. If Coalescence was the feeling of remorse and your deeds on your shoulders, all coming out in an emotional piece, then this is Petrichor 5's final attempt at crying out. This planet in disarray is doing everything it can to express itself towards you. Listen to it cry out. Listen to the pain it's enduring. This is not all your fault in Risk of Rain 2, but you're responsible now as an invader to this place. And as you're on your way to confront Mithrix and make your escape from this place, you're forced to listen to the final desperate pleas of Petrichor 5. And as you fight Mithrix, you're confronted with this intense guitar that gives way to the wailing synth we know all too well by now. This is the thousands of years of agony Mithrix has had to deal with, all flowing through you musically. He's crying out, not in the same way as the planet, but not too differently. And as you slay him, Mithrix has a chance to cry directly out to his late brother. Brother, help me. This plane grows dark, brother. I cannot see you. Where are you? Brother, perhaps we will get it right next time. With Mithrix now dead, the Void has full influence over the moon and Petrichor 5, and as we escape the planet and its moon, we see it completely engulfed. And as we escape, we're greeted with that same melody we know from Coalescence, though much more muted, as if the life force of Petrichor 5 is fading. Along with it, new ending quotes like the first game, though they're quite different in tone. Acrid, and so it left, with delusions of freedom. Artificer, and so she left, in love with a new passion, to explore. Bandit, and so he left, grateful for his luck. Captain, and so he left, with a new tale to tell. Commando, and so he left, with new orders and new questions. Engineer, and so he left, with newfound inspirations. Huntress, and so she left, yearning for her next great hunt. Loader, and so she left, heart still racing. Mercenary, and so he left, with dreams of good food and a peaceful night. Multi, and so it left, ready to recharge. Railgunner, and so she left, ready to take her shot. Rex, and so it left, ready to grow into something more. Void Fiend, and so it comes, for all of us. These quotes are all quite different tonally from the first game, which is fitting. The actions of Risk of Rain 2, while still a slaughter, feel less personal than the first game, which I think is due to Providence already being killed, and the planet already being in a state of chaos. It feels less on the survivors' shoulders, though they all still feel remorse. The Risk of Rain games have all been very important to me if it wasn't obvious. I played them both since release and have pretty much always held them in very high regard. For those who made it this far, thank you for watching. This has been easily my longest video. I ended up having a lot to say. Please also, if you haven't, like, comment, and subscribe, yada yada. But also check out both Risk of Rain 1 and 2, and especially their soundtracks. Links will be below. And so he left, with new ambitions in mind.